The document was never meant to be digitized. It existed only as a carbon copy, buried beneath the frost of a Cold War winter in Suitland, Maryland. In the official records of the 1984 United States Census, the data is clean, the numbers are balanced, and the American population is accounted for. But deep within the federal archives, there exists a classified anomaly, a file encrypted not by code, but by silence. 12,000 citizens were erased from the public ledger, yet they remained on the magnetic tapes of Sublevel 4. These were not errors. They were a modern paradox, a hidden truth that suggested a shadow population living amongst us, occupying houses that appeared empty on every map. The file was stamped "Never Open," yet we begin tonight, uncovering the architecture of a ghost nation. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room. The air here is recycled and cold, a sterile chill that clings to the heavy steel cabinets. The file folder is brittle, cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with the weight of secrets kept too long. As we pull the first reel from its sleeve, the faint static of history begins to play, a low-frequency vibration that bridges the gap between the world we see and the archive we are about to enter. To understand the sublevel for archive, one must first understand the physical reality of the 1984 Federal Center. This was an era where data was physical. It had weight. It occupied space. The mainframe computers of the time, specifically the IBM 3081 units, were massive monoliths that required constant cooling and specialized environments. In the Suitland facility, the census data was processed in a hierarchy of security. Levels 1 through 3 handled the public-facing statistics, the demographics of a growing nation, the shifting economics of the suburbs, and the standard birth-to-death ratios of the American heartland. But Level 4 was different. On the original blueprints of the building, Level 4 is marked only as utility and HVAC support. To the casual observer, it was a floor of pipes, ducts, and electrical transformers. Yet, for those with the highest clearance, it housed a non-standard residential archive. This was a room without a door, not in the literal sense, but in the bureaucratic sense. There was no hallway leading to it, no sign on any elevator button. Access was achieved through a service lift in the loading docks, triggered by a sequence of commands that were never written down. Inside this archival void, the temperature was kept at a constant 18 degrees Celsius. The walls were lined with magnetic tape reels, thousands of them, each containing the digital ghosts of a census count that the public was never supposed to see. It was here, in the dim glow of amber monitors, that the anomaly was first detected. It wasn't a sudden glitch. It was a slow, creeping realization that the numbers didn't add up. When the census workers in the upper levels counted the population of Virginia, they found a surplus. A surplus of 12,000 entities that moved, breathed, and occupied space, but possessed no legal identity. The archive was built to contain this discrepancy. It was a repository for people who didn't exist, stored in a room that wasn't on the map. As we delve deeper into these records, the quiet dread of the facility begins to manifest. One can almost feel the presence of the missing thousands, their lives reduced to magnetic pulses on a spinning reel. The archive doesn't just hold data. It holds a silence that is almost physical. Every flicker of the monitor, every faint click of the processing drive, feels like a heartbeat from a world that was erased by design. Arthur Pendergast was a man of routine and precise mathematics. In the autumn of 1984, his role at the Census Bureau was to ensure the integrity of the Fairfax County dataset. He was an expert in standard deviation, a man who believed that every outlier had an explanation. But the 12,000 extra entries he found on tape 84B defied every model of social geography. He spent nights in the quiet isolation of the archive, cross-referencing these individuals with every known database. He checked social security records, hospital birth logs, and even local school enrollments. The results were always the same: 0 matches. It was as if these 12,000 people had appeared out of thin air on the day the census began and vanished the moment the field agents left the neighborhood. Pendergast began to notice patterns that were unnervingly precise. These ghost residents were clustered in specific suburban developments, newly built neighborhoods, where the trees were still saplings and the paint on the fences was barely dry. In these neighborhoods, the census data showed a 100% occupancy rate. However, local utility records showed that these specific homes were consuming 0 kilowatts of electricity and 0 gallons of water. Pendergast stared at the data until his eyes burned. How could a household exist, count as a family of 4, and yet produce no waste, consume no power, and leave no digital footprint? The intellectual curiosity turned into a quiet, cold paranoia. He began to suspect that the census wasn't just counting people, it was counting placeholders. He theorized that the government was testing a new form of demographic masking, a way to hide large-scale movements of people or assets by burying them within the noise of a standard census count. But the deeper he went into sublevel 4, the more he realized that the masking wasn't the goal. The goal was the containment of the anomaly itself. The archive was a digital cage. Pendergast found memos unsigned and undated, referring to Project Looking Glass and the silent population. These documents suggested that the 12,000 residents were not a mistake, but a planned inclusion. The room without a door was where the evidence went to die. Pendergast realized that his discovery wasn't a triumph of data analysis, it was a death sentence for his career. The archive was breathing, the tapes were spinning, and the 12,000 ghosts were watching him through the very numbers he was trying to solve. The air in the archive grew thinner, the cold air from the vents smelling of ozone and old paper. He knew he had to take the tape. He had to prove that the silence was a lie. The year 1984 is often remembered through the lens of fiction, but the technological reality was perhaps more unsettling. This was the dawn of the centralized database, a time when the American government began to consolidate its knowledge of its citizens into a singular, interconnected web of mainframes. The IBM 3081 was the pinnacle of this effort. It was a machine of immense power, capable of processing millions of instructions per second. Yet it was also a machine of profound mystery. In the archives of Sublevel 4, these machines operated in a vacuum. The software they ran was not the standard COBOL or Fortran used in the public sectors. It was something proprietary, something designed to handle nonlinear data. When we look back at the 1984 census, we see a nation transitioning from paper to pulse. The field agents still walked the streets with clipboards, knocking on doors and asking questions. But the moment those paper forms entered the federal center, they were transformed. They were scanned, digitized, and fed into the maw of the mainframe. For the 12,000 ghost residents of Virginia, this process was their only form of existence. They were born in the scanner, lived in the buffer memory, and were stored on tape 84B. The archival researchers of today look at this period as a digital dark age. Because the storage media was so fragile and the hardware so specific, much of the data from that era has been lost to bit rot or physical decay. But tape 84B was different. It was coated in a specialized magnetic material, designed to last for centuries rather than decades. It was as if the creators of the archive knew that one day, someone would need to find these people again. The technology of the time allowed for a level of secrecy that is impossible in our modern, hyper-connected world. There were no leakers on the internet, no satellite images available to the public. If a house existed on a census map but was empty in reality, no one would ever know. The archive was the perfect hiding place. It was a world made of magnetic pulses, a world where 12,000 people could live for 40 years without ever taking a single breath of air. As the tape reels spin in our narrative tonight, we are not just listening to a story. We are witnessing the birth of the modern surveillance state, where the data is more real than the person it represents. The cold, analytical nature of the 1980s mainframe is the heartbeat of this mystery. It is a slow, steady pulse that reminds us that the archive is never truly empty. The existence of Sublevel 4 was a geopolitical necessity. During the height of the Cold War, the United States was obsessed with continuity of government and demographic resilience. The fear was not just of a nuclear strike, but of a total collapse of the social fabric. To combat this, the strategic planners developed the Shadow Household Protocol. The 12,000 residents discovered by Pendergast were, in one theory, a reserve population, a set of identities and residential slots, kept open for high-value assets in the event of a national emergency. But this theory doesn't explain the screaming data found on tape 84B. These were simply reserve identities. The data would be static and dormant. Instead, the archive showed a population that was hyper. The records showed them moving between houses, changing jobs within the secret ledger, and even aging at a rate that matched the external world. This suggests that the archive wasn't just a list. It was a simulation that was somehow tethered to the physical world of suburban Virginia. The people living near the census-dense zones of Fairfax County in 1984 often reported a phenomenon known as the suburban hum. It was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, most noticeable in the quiet hours between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Medical records from the time show a spike in sleep disorders and unexplained anxiety in the exact neighborhoods where the 12,000 ghost residents were supposedly located. The archive in sublevel 4 was the source of this hum. It was the physical manifestation of a digital presence. The 12,000 were not just names on a tape, they were a frequency that was being broadcast into the foundations of American homes. The geopolitical implications are staggering. If a government could simulate a population so convincingly that it affected the physical health and environment of its actual citizens, then the line between the archive and reality had already dissolved. Sublevel 4 was the laboratory for this dissolution. The room without a door was the only place where the two worlds met. It was a thin spot in the fabric of the nation, a place where a data analyst could look into a monitor and see the reflection of a world that shouldn't exist. The cold air of the archive carries the scent of this otherworld, a scent of ozone, of static, and of a profound, lonely silence. As we move through the documents, we find maps of Virginia that have been subtly altered. Streets that don't exist on public maps are drawn in fine, red ink. Houses are marked with symbols that correspond to the non-standard designations on the magnetic tapes. The archive is a mirror, and the reflection it shows is one of a nation that has been colonized from within by its own data. As the hours grow late in the federal center, the machines in sublevel 4 begin their nightly maintenance cycle. This is the time when the ghost residents are most active in the data stream. It is a time of high-speed processing and deep layer encryption. For the modern researcher, looking back at these 1984 records is like looking into a deep, dark well. You can see the glimmer of something at the bottom, but the depth is impossible to measure. The 12,000 citizens of tape 84B are still there, in a sense, though the tapes have been moved, and sublevel 4 has been officially decommissioned and filled with concrete. The data has a way of surviving. It migrates. It hides in the cracks of newer systems, a legacy code that no one knows how to delete. The room without a door may be physically gone, but the architectural anomaly it created remains. We think of our homes as private sanctuaries, places where we are truly alone, but the archive suggests otherwise. It suggests that every house has a shadow, every neighborhood has a ghost, and every census has a secret. The cold, analytical truth of 1984 is that we are never just ourselves. We are also the data that represents us, and sometimes, that data has a life of its own. The silence of the archive is not an empty silence. It is a crowded one. It is a silence filled with the whispers of 12,000 people who never lived, yet never died. As we close the first file of the evening, the air in the room seems to settle. The hum of the servers fades into a soft, steady pulse, like a distant heart beating beneath the earth. The records are still there. The tapes are still waiting. And the truth of sublevel 4 is only the beginning of the trail. There is a specific reason why the data on tape 84B was described as screaming, and it has nothing to do with digital corruption. It has to do with what was found when Arthur Pendergast finally decided to visit one of the ghost houses in person. He didn't find an empty building. He found something that the mainframe had been trying to warn him about all along. The archive is breathing, and the next reel is already beginning to spin. The story of the missing 12,000 is not just a story of a census error. It is a story of what happens when the government builds a house for something that doesn't need a door. The records of sublevel 4 are vast, but they are only the skeletal remains of the mystery. To understand why the tapes were truly recorded, we must look at the physical evidence left behind in the suburbs. Arthur Pendergast's final report mentions a single, recurring frequency found in every ghost household, a sound that matched the resonance of a specific magnetic tape. This leads us to the next classified file in our journey, magnetic tape 84B, the data that screams. The silence is ending, and the archive is about to speak. In the quiet, climate-controlled depths of the National Archives, sound is a forbidden commodity. Most classified records are silent ink on paper, or still photographs of things that never happened. But the file labeled 84B is different. It is an encrypted anomaly that exists on iron oxide magnetic tape, a reel that was officially erased in 1985 but physically recovered from a dumpster behind the Census Bureau. This tape does not contain voices, nor music, nor the standard binary static of 1980s computing. Instead, it contains a sonic paradox, a digital footprint of 12,000 people who do not exist on any map. When this tape is fed into a modern spectrum analyzer, the waveform does not look like data. It looks like a scream, not a human cry, but a jagged, impossible frequency that suggests the 12,000 missing residents of Virginia were never people at all, but a frequency being broadcast into the suburban soil. The file was stamped "never open," yet we begin tonight, listening to the data that screams. The only sound in this dimly lit room is the quiet hum of the server, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a physical weight against the chest. The file folder is cold to the touch, its edges brittle from decades of being ignored. As the tape begins to spin, the faint smell of ozone and old dust fills the air. A sensory bridge to a year when the government tried to digitize the soul of a nation. To understand the weight of tape 84B, one must understand the physical nature of memory in 1984. Before the cloud, before the instant accessibility of the modern web, information lived on magnetic reels. These were sensitive, temperamental objects. Each inch of tape was a physical record of a moment in time. If a file was erased, the magnetic particles were scattered, leaving behind a blank, white noise. But tape 84B refused to be blank. When Arthur Pendergast first pulled this reel from the sublevel for archive, he expected to find the standard residential logs of Fairfax County. Instead, he found a layer of sound that existed underneath the data dot as the CRT monitor in his small cubicle flickered with a pale, sickly green light. Pendergast realized that the census records for the 12,000 missing individuals were not just text entries. They were audio. Every house that appeared empty on the electrical grid, every resident who lacked a birth certificate, had a corresponding frequency on this tape. It was as if the government hadn't just counted these people, they had synthesized them. The analytical mind struggles with this concept. Why would the Bureau of the Census record audio patterns for citizens who technically didn't exist? Pendergast's journals describe his first attempt to play the audio back through a standard headset. He writes of a pressure that built behind his eyes, a sensation of being in a room that was simultaneously empty and crowded. The screaming wasn't a sound heard with the ears, it was a vibration felt in the jawbone. It was the sound of 12,000 non-existent lives trying to occupy the same physical space. This is the cold reality of the archive. The data isn't just numbers, it is a resonance. In the Tier 1 suburbs of 1980s America, this resonance was being pumped through the telephone lines and the underground plumbing. Tape 84B was the master recording the conductor's score for a phantom population. Every time the tape spins, we are not just looking at a mystery, we are observing a scientific experiment in demographic haunting. The air in the archive grows colder as the tape reaches the 3-minute mark, the point where the suburban hum officially begins. Scientific records from the mid-80s often mention a phenomenon called the suburban hum. In the quiet, affluent neighborhoods of Virginia and Maryland, residents began to complain of a sound they couldn't quite locate. It wasn't the air conditioner and it wasn't the distant highway. It was a persistent, low-frequency thrum that made the windows vibrate in their frames at 3 a.m. For decades, it was dismissed as mass hysteria or industrial runoff. But Tape 84B provides a much darker explanation. The screaming data on the tape is perfectly synchronized with the reports of the hum when Pendergast overlaid the audio from the tape with the seismic records of Fairfax County. The waveforms matched with 99% accuracy. The 12,000 ghost residents were not living in the houses. They were the houses. Each phantom entry in the census corresponded to a specific resonant frequency being emitted by the building materials of newly constructed suburban homes. This was the frequency of compliance. It was an archival project designed to see if a population could be controlled, not through laws or police, but through the very physics of their environment. If you could broadcast a feeling of presence into an empty house, you could manipulate the property values, the movement of real people, and the psychological state of an entire zip code. The American audience of the 1980s was the perfect test subject for this. They were moving into the suburbs in record numbers, seeking the American dream of safety and predictability. The government, through the Census Bureau and the NSA, provided that predictability by filling the gaps with digital ghosts. Tape 84B was the heartbeat of this shadow society. As Pendergast listened to the tape, he began to hear things that weren't meant for human ears, subliminal commands buried in the jagged static. Commands like remain, wait, and accounted for. The intellectual dread of this discovery cannot be overstated. It suggests that the census was never about counting the people who were there. It was about ensuring that the people who were there never realized they were living next to a void. The monitor flickers again, a sharp snap of static in the cold air. We are now halfway through the tape, and the screaming is beginning to change. It is no longer a jagged mess of noise. It is beginning to form a pattern. A pattern that sounds like a name. There is a specific smell associated with old magnetic taper, metallic, earthy scent, that reminds some of the smell of blood. This is because the coating on the tape is iron oxide. In the sublevel for archive, this smell was pervasive. Pendergast spent weeks huffing this metallic air, his mind becoming as magnetized as the reels he studied. He began to believe that the iron in the tape was connected to the iron in the human bloodstream. He hypothesized that tape 84B was a bridge. If the government could record the frequency of a person onto a metallic tape, could they then broadcast that frequency back into a living person? This is where the archival records take a sharp turn into the uncanny. Pendergast began to track the health records of the people living next door to the ghost households. These people were real, they were counted, and they were paying taxes. But their medical files showed a strange thinning of their iron levels. It was as if the ghost households were literal vampires, drawing the biological essence out of the real residents to sustain their digital existence on tape 84B. The screaming data was the sound of this extraction. It was a high-tension wire pulled across the throat of the American suburbs. Pendergast writes in his journal, "I played the tape at half speed tonight. I didn't hear ghosts. I heard the sound of a vacuum. These 12,000 entities aren't here to occupy space. They are here to create it by hollowing out the neighbors." This reflection on the nature of space and identity is what makes the archive chill so unsettling. It challenges the American Tier 1 listener to consider their own neighbors. In a world of high-density housing and digital surveillance, how do you know the person behind the fence is a person at all? Or are they just a resonant frequency broadcast from an iron oxide reel in a room without a door? The tape machine clicks, the mechanical gears grinding softly in the silence. The screaming has reached a crescendo now. It is a wall of sound, a solid barrier of audio that feels like it could stop a heart. Pendergast noticed that when the tape reached this point, the lights in the Federal Center would dim. The archive was hungry. It needed more than just magnetic pulses to keep the 12,000 alive. It needed attention. It needed to be heard. As we move deeper into the 84B file, we find the first mention of Project Looking Glass. This was a classified operation that sat at the intersection of early computer science and psychological warfare. The goal of Looking Glass was to create a consensus reality. If everyone in a neighborhood believes that 100 people live on their street, then, for all intents and purposes, 100 people exist. Even if 12 of them are nothing more than data on a tape. Tape 84B was the golden record for Looking Glass. It was the proof of concept. The anomaly wasn't a mistake. It was the success of the project. The 12,000 residents were the first citizens of a new America, one that existed entirely within the archives. But Looking Glass had a side effect that the planners didn't anticipate. The data began to evolve. The screaming on the tape wasn't just a byproduct of the frequency, it was the data attempting to communicate with the mainframe. Pendergast found logs that showed the IBM 3081 computers in sublevel 4 were answering the tape. At night, when the building was empty except for the security guards and the janitors, the machines were engaged in a 20 MHz conversation with the 12,000 ghosts. The encryption on tape 84B wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep the data in. It was a digital cage designed by the NSA to prevent the frequency from leaking into the wider telephone network. But in 1984, the lines were primitive. The shielding was thin. Pendergast discovered that the screaming had already leaked. He found traces of the 84B frequency in the background of long-distance calls made across the East Coast. People would be talking to their families in Ohio or Florida, and for a split second, they would hear a faint, jagged cry in the background. They assumed it was line noise. They assumed it was the weather, but it was the 12,000. They were using the American telecommunications grid as a nervous system. The archive was no longer contained. It was expanding, one phone call at a time. The cold, analytical dread of this realization is what eventually broke Arthur Pendergast. He wasn't just looking at an archive. He was looking at a virus made of sound. The final minutes of tape 84B are the most difficult to listen to. The screaming stops. It doesn't fade. It just ceases, leaving behind a silence that is louder than the noise. Pendergast describes this silence as absolute. It is the sound of a total vacuum, a place where no information can exist. When he reached this part of the tape, he realized the true purpose of the 12,000 ghost residents. They weren't a reserve population. They weren't a psychological experiment. They were a deletion protocol. The 12,000 names were placeholders for things that had been erased from American history. Every time the government needed to make a scandal or a tragedy disappear, they would assign the details to one of the 12,000 entities on tape 84B. They were the landfill of the national memory. The screaming was the sound of the information being crushed under its own weight. It was the sound of truths being compressed into lies. When the tape finally reaches the end of the reel, the plastic leader snaps against the machine, a sharp, sudden sound like a bone breaking in a quiet room. The archive is done speaking for now. But the iron oxide remains. Even today, in the digital age, the legacy of tape 84B persists. The frequency hasn't disappeared. It has simply shifted into a range that we no longer recognize. We call it background noise. We call it white noise. We play it to help us sleep. But for those who know the history of Sublevel 4, that white noise is a warning. It is the sound of the 12,000. Still waiting to be counted. The air in our archival room is still. The CRT monitor finally going dark. The file on tape 84B is thick with redacted memos and blurry photographs of empty street. It is a cold, intellectual journey into the heart of a nation that prefers its secrets to be heard rather than seen. As we prepare to return the reel to its sleeve, we must acknowledge the one thing Pendergast never could. The archive is not just a place where things are stored, it is a place where things are kept alive. The 12,000 residents of Fairfax County are still there, somewhere between the iron oxide and the iron in your blood. They are the neighbors you never see, the cars you never hear, and the names you can't quite remember. The tape is silent, but the screaming hasn't stopped. It has just become the foundation of the world we live in. Looking back at the documents from the 1985 audit, the official conclusion was that tape 84B was a victim of magnetic migration, a process where the data from one layer of tape bleeds into the next, creating a ghost image. They claimed the screaming was just a technical error, a failure of the iron oxide coating. They filled the room without a door with concrete and told Arthur Pendergast that his career was over. But archives have a way of outliving their creators. The concrete in Suitland, Maryland, is cracked now, and the magnetic fields in the area are still fluctuating. The Tier 1 audience of today is more skeptical, more aware of the glitches in the system. We know that data doesn't just disappear, it hides. It waits for someone to pull the reel from the trash. The story of the 1984 Census anomaly is a story of our own digital mortality. It reminds us that we are only as real as the records that contain us. If the government can create 12,000 people with a tape recorder and a mainframe, then they can just as easily erase us with a magnet. This is the archive chill, the realization that the ground beneath our suburban feet is hollow, filled with the static of 1,000 classified secrets. The iron oxide on our hands is cold. The scent of ozone is fading. We have listened to the data that screams, and we have survived the frequency. But the archive is a vast and terrible place. And tape 84B is only one reel in a library of millions. There are other tapes, there are other frequencies, and there are other neighbors who are watching the quiet windows of our homes. As we sit in the silence of the finished reel, we are left with a single, haunting thought. If the 12,000 were the sound of the 1984 census, what does the 2026 census sound like? Is the screaming louder now? Or has it finally become a melody that we have all learned to hum in our sleep? The archive remains open. The files are still waiting, and the truth is always buried exactly where you were told not to look. The screaming of the tape was a warning about the houses, but Arthur Pendergast found something even more unsettling when he stopped looking at the data and started looking at the physical maps. He realized the ghost households weren't scattered randomly, they were forming a shape that could only be seen from the air, and only at night. This leads us to the next classified file, the quiet neighbors, a pattern of cold windows. The windows are watching, and the lights are about to go out. In the manicured suburbs of Northern Virginia, there is a geometry to the silence that goes unnoticed by the casual observer. For decades, the neighborhoods surrounding the federal center were seen as the pinnacle of the American dream. But buried within a classified census file is a modern paradox that suggests a darker architecture. In 1984, an internal anomaly was flagged involving 12,000 households that appeared active on paper, yet remained invisible to the physical world. These were residences where the mail was delivered but never collected, where the lawns were mowed by unseen hands, and where every encrypted data point pointed to a hidden truth. Researchers eventually discovered a pattern of cold windows homes that, even in the dead of a winter night, emitted zero thermal energy despite being listed as occupied by families of 4. This was not a clerical error, it was a deliberate erasure of reality, a specialized protocol designed to hide a shadow population within the standard deviation of suburban life. The archival records suggest that these houses weren't just empty, they were occupied by something that didn't require heat, light, or a pulse. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Outside the archive, the world continues its frantic pace, but here, Time is suspended in the amber glow of a flickering CRT monitor. There is a faint scent of old paper and ozone in the air, a sterile chill that settles into the lungs as we pull the first topographical map from the folder. The lines are precise, the margins are clean, but there is an unsettling symmetry to the red ink markings that denote the ghost households. As we look closer, the static of a nearby processing drive crackles softly, a reminder that every secret has a frequency. We are stepping into the landscape of the quiet neighbors, where the windows are always dark, and the truth is hidden in the temperature of the glass. To understand the pattern of cold windows, one must first look at the map of Fairfax County as it existed in the mid-80s. It was a time of rapid expansion, of sprawling cul-de-sacs and identical brick-faced homes. Arthur Pendergast, the data analyst who first stumbled upon the 12,000 missing souls of the census, spent his nights driving through these neighborhoods. He wasn't looking for people, he was looking for the gaps they left behind. He noticed that the ghost households were not scattered randomly. They were positioned in a perfect, repeating hexagonal pattern across the county line. Every 6 houses, there was a residence that felt different. The air around these specific plots seemed heavier, more stagnant. Pendergast would park his car at the end of the street, the monitor flicker of his dashboard the only light in the darkness, and watch. He watched for the flicker of a television, the silhouette of a child in an upstairs bedroom, or the simple glow of a kitchen light. He saw none of it. These houses remained as dark as the soil they were built upon, yet the census records claimed they were teeming with life. Pendergast's investigation took a technological turn when he acquired a prototype thermal imaging camera, bulky, classified piece of hardware normally reserved for military surveillance. On a bitter January night in 1985, when the temperature had dropped well below freezing, he turned the lens toward one of the houses on tape 84B. In a standard American home, the windows are the brightest points in an infrared spectrum. They are where the heat of a family, the furnace, the cooking, the very breath of inhabitants leaks into the world. But as Pendergast looked through the viewfinder, he saw a black void. The house was not just cold, it was at a state of absolute thermal equilibrium with the surrounding air. There was no internal heat source, no pilot light, no biological warmth. Yet, through the faint static of the camera's display, he could see something else. A faint glowing pulse emanating from the center of the basement, a rhythmic light that matched the frequency of the screaming data he had found on the magnetic reels. It was a cold heart beating in a cold house. The construction of these houses followed a specific set of blueprints that Pendergast recovered from a shredded file in the archives. They were built using a high-density lead-lined insulation that was officially listed as experimental. In reality, it was a containment field. The houses were designed to be airtight, not to keep the warmth in but to keep the frequency from leaking out. The Tier 1 American suburbs were being used as a massive, decentralized storage facility. Each cold window was a lens into a pocket of space that had been repurposed for the storage of non-biological assets. Pendergast theorized that the 12,000 residents weren't people who had been erased, but rather, they were the anchors for a massive underground server network. The houses were merely shells, the suburban equivalent of a computer chassis. The quiet neighbors were the processors, and the neighborhood was the mainframe. As he stood on the sidewalk, the cold air biting at his skin, Pendergast realized that the people living in the warm-lit houses next door were completely unaware that they were sleeping next to a classified abyss. As we delve deeper into the archival records, the symmetry of the project becomes truly staggering. Each hexagon of ghost houses formed a node, and each node was connected by a series of underground fiber optic cables that didn't appear on any municipal utility map. These neighborhoods were the birth of the smart city, but the intelligence was not for the benefit of the residents. It was an encrypted infrastructure for a government that was preparing for a world where the population could be simulated. Pendergast found evidence of Project Mirror, a psychological operation that used the quiet neighbors to influence the behavior of the real ones. The cold windows acted as a subtle visual anchor of stability. In a world of Cold War tension and economic uncertainty, the sight of a quiet, perfect home, even an empty one, created a sense of order. But it was a false order, a manufactured calm that relied on the erasure of 12,000 identities. The monitor flicker in the archive room seems to pulse in time with Pendergast's heartbeat as he realizes the scale of the deception. The suburban dream was a facade, and the foundation was built on a pattern of cold glass. In the folder, there is a handwritten notebook belonging to a man named Silas Vance, a night shift janitor who worked at the Federal Center for 30 years. His notes provide the physical bridge to the archival data. Vance wrote about the deliveries that arrived at the loading docks at 2 a.m. and marked crates that were never opened in the light of day. He wrote about the technicians who wore suits made of a shimmering silver fabric and never spoke a word to the custodial staff. But most importantly, he wrote about the key of sublevel 4. He claimed that once a month he was ordered to drive a company van to the residential zones and monitor the glass. His instructions were simple. If a window showed a trace of condensation or a hint of warmth, he was to report it immediately. The quiet neighbors had to remain cold. Any sign of heat was a sign of a breach, a sign that the anomaly was beginning to manifest into something physical. Vance's log ends with a final, chilling entry. The windows in Sector 7 are starting to sweat. I can hear the humming through the brickwork. They aren't cold anymore. What happens when a cold house begins to warm? According to the erased files, a breach in the thermal containment led to what the researchers called a demographic bleed. The simulated data of the 12,000 residents began to interact with the physical world. Pendergast recorded instances of residents in Fairfax County hearing footsteps in empty hallways and seeing shadows move behind the curtains of the cold houses. The encrypted reality of the archive was leaking into the suburban landscape. The pattern of cold windows was the only thing keeping the two worlds separate. When the glass warmed, the boundary thinned. The hidden truth was that the government wasn't just storing data. They were storing a version of America that was more stable, more compliant, and more controllable than the real one. But the simulation was never meant to have a temperature. Heat is a byproduct of life, and the quiet neighbors were never supposed to live. The static on the archival tapes grows louder here, a jagged wall of sound that mirrors Pendergast's rising dread. He knew that if the pattern broke, the archive would no longer be a place of storage, it would become a place of replacement. The official response to Pendergast's findings was a total digital erasure. Within 48 hours of filing his report on the thermal anomalies, his clearance was revoked, and his office in Sublevel 4 was stripped bare. The Census Bureau released a memo stating that the Fairfax County data had been corrupted by a magnetic solar flare, and that the 12,000 entries were a ghosting effect caused by faulty hardware. The houses and the hexagonal pattern were quietly sold to private holding companies with ties to the Department of Defense. The lead-lined insulation was replaced, the basements were filled with concrete, and the windows were fitted with a new type of reflective glass that made it impossible to see inside. The pattern was hidden, but it wasn't destroyed. The archival researchers believe that the project simply moved deeper underground, away from the prying eyes of men like Pendergast. But the cold windows remain a permanent part of the suburban architecture, a silent reminder of a census that counted the dead to control the living. As we sit in the archive tonight, looking at these faded maps and encrypted files, the legacy of the quiet neighbors feels more relevant than ever. In the modern era, we are surrounded by smart devices and interconnected networks that track our every move. We think of ourselves as the primary users of this technology, but the archival records suggest that we are merely the noise in a much larger, much colder system. The 12,000 residents of Tape 84B were the first iteration of a digital twin, a version of humanity that exists only to fill the gaps in the data. The pattern of cold windows was the prototype for a world where reality is managed by an algorithm. The cold air in the archive room carries the weight of this realization. We are living in a landscape of shadows, where the house next door might be a server, and the neighbor you wave to might be a frequency. The monitor flickers one last time, the pale green light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The truth is not in what we can see, but in what we cannot feel. Arthur Pendergast disappeared from the public record in 1987. His last known location was a small motel on the edge of the Fairfax County line, overlooking a neighborhood of quiet neighbors. His final journal entry was not a mathematical formula or a dataset. It was a single sentence: "The windows are watching me, and they are starting to feel like home." This reflection marks the end of the physical investigation into the 1984 anomaly, but the archival investigation is far from over. The pattern of cold windows is still visible if you know how to look. On the coldest nights of the year, when the frost patterns form on every pane of glass in the suburb, look for the house where the windows remain perfectly clear. Look for the house where the snow doesn't melt on the roof. That is where the quiet neighbors live. That is where the archive is still breathing. The cold glass is a barrier, but it is also a mirror. It shows us a version of ourselves that is perfectly accounted for, perfectly silent, and perfectly cold. The pattern of the windows was only the surface of the anomaly. Pendergast's notes mention a final discovery, a reason why the houses had to be positioned in a hexagon. It wasn't just for signal strength. It was a calculation that determined the exact moment when the simulation would finally override the standard deviation of the real world. To find that answer, we must go back to the mainframe itself and ask the one question the government tried to erase. Why did the machine start failing only at 3:14 a.m.? This leads us to our next classified file, standard deviation. Why the algorithm failed. The clock is ticking, and the archive is waiting. In the summer of 1984, the most powerful mainframe in the United States government began to produce a mathematical impossibility. While the official census algorithm was designed to account for every human soul within the borders of Virginia, a classified anomaly began to emerge within the standard deviation. A single file, encrypted behind 7 layers of federal security, revealed a hidden truth that the machines were never meant to process. The algorithm didn't just fail, it witnessed an erasure of reality. 12,000 residents were appearing and vanishing from the data stream with a rhythmic precision that defied the laws of human movement. This was not a glitch in the code, but a manifestation of a shadow population that the government had tried to bury in the margins of the census. Every erased file and every encrypted byte pointed to a modern paradox. The machines were counting people who existed in a space where physics did not apply. The data suggested that the standard deviation was no longer a measure of error, but a gateway for a simulation that had grown too large to contain. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this sterile archival space, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale green light, casting long shadows against the stacks of classified documents. This is the graveyard of Project Looking Glass, where the dreams of a simulated America were stored on iron oxide reels. As we pull the primary reel for the 1984 audit, a faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that data is never truly dead. We are entering the heart of the mainframe, where the logic of the algorithm met the chaos of the unseen. The windows are dark, the servers are cold, and the truth is waiting in the numbers that don't add up. To understand why the algorithm failed, one must understand the absolute precision of 1980s data entry. This was an era before the chaos of the modern internet, where every digit was verified by human hands, and verified again by the massive IBM 3081 mainframes. Arthur Pendergast, the analyst tasked with the Fairfax County audit, believed that math was the ultimate language of truth. But as he looked at the standard deviation for the 1984 census, he found a pattern that math could not explain. In a normal population count, the margin of error follows a predictable curve, a slight ripple in the data caused by birth, death, and relocation. But in Virginia, the curve was perfectly flat. It was as if 12,000 people were living their lives with the mathematical consistency of a computer program. There were no unexpected births, no late-night hospital visits, and no sudden moves. They were perfectly predictable, and in the world of data, perfect predictability is the first sign of a lie. The failure of the algorithm wasn't constant, it was temporal. Pendergast discovered that the data remained perfectly stable for 23 hours of the day, but at exactly 3:14 a.m., the standard deviation would skyrocket. It was a digital explosion that lasted for exactly 60 seconds. During this minute, the mainframe would report that the 12,000 residents were simultaneously in their homes and moving at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The sensors in the hexagonal ghost houses would register a massive spike in caloric intake and electricity usage that lasted only for a heartbeat. Then, at 3:15 a.m., the data would return to its flat, impossible baseline. Pendergast spent weeks watching the monitor flicker during these midnight shifts, his eyes burning in the pale light. He realized that the algorithm wasn't failing because of a bug. It was failing because it was trying to record a population that only existed in our physical reality for 1 minute every night. As we sit in the archive tonight, the reflection of the flickering monitor seems to dance in the cold air. The archival records suggest that the 3:14 a.m. anomaly was the result of a phase shift in the Project Looking Glass simulation. The 12,000 residents were not physical people, but data packets that were being rendered into the suburban landscape. The algorithm failed because it was never designed to account for non-biological entities. Pendergast found a memo deep in the classified file that referred to the 3:14 a.m. window as the refresh cycle. It was the moment when the simulation updated its parameters, drawing power from the local grid to stabilize the digital ghosts for another 24 hours. The standard deviation was the only place where the two worlds overlapped, a mathematical scar on the face of the census. Pendergast realized that the algorithm was actually working perfectly. It was the reality it was measuring that had become corrupted. The architects of this void were not mathematicians, but psychological engineers. They understood that if you could manipulate the data, you could manipulate the perception of an entire nation. The census is the foundation of American democracy. It determines funding, representation, and growth. By inserting 12,000 ghost residents into the Virginia suburbs, the government was creating phantom wealth and phantom power. But the algorithm was a witness that couldn't be silenced. Every time the code reached the encrypted anomaly, it produced a high-pitched whine that the night shift analysts called the hum. It was the sound of a computer screaming at a reality it couldn't process. Pendergast recorded this hum on a private tape, a sensory bridge to the digital madness of Level 4. He began to wonder if the algorithm was trying to warn him, or if it was slowly being rewritten by the very ghosts it was trying to count. The cold air of the archive seems to vibrate with that same frequency tonight. In the folder there is a series of thermal printouts from the night the algorithm finally crashed. The paper is yellowed and smells of old dust, but the ink tells a terrifying story. On July 12, 1984, the standard deviation didn't just spike, it broke the scale. For 3 hours, the mainframe reported that Fairfax County was occupied by over 2 million people, 10 times the actual population. These temporary residents were all assigned to the same 12,000 addresses. Pendergast watched in horror as the monitor displayed a sea of data points. A swarm of digital identities competing for the same physical space. This was the maximum deviation event, a moment where the simulation nearly overrode the real world. The archival logs show that the technicians had to physically cut the power to Sublevel 4 to prevent the mainframe from melting down. When they rebooted the system, the 2 million residents were gone, erased from the memory banks as if they had never been there. Only the original 12,000 remained, sitting silently in their cold houses. What remains of this failure is a mathematical scar that still exists in the federal databases. Even today, if you look at the historical census data for 1984, there is a missing block of timer gap in the records where the algorithm was supposed to be. The government erased the files, but they couldn't erase the impact on the system. Pendergast's final analysis suggested that the algorithm didn't just fail because of the simulation, it failed because it had developed a memory of the ghosts. The code began to anticipate the 3:14 a.m. refresh cycle, creating ghost processes that ran in the background even when the mainframe was idle. This is the hidden truth of the modern era. Our algorithms are still running on the foundations laid in Sublevel 4. The anomaly hasn't been fixed. It has been integrated. We are living in a world where the standard deviation is no longer an error, but a feature of a managed reality. The faint static in the archive room feels like a whisper from those original lines of code. Before he disappeared, Pendergast wrote one final equation on the back of a classified briefing. It was a formula for calculating the density of the unseen. He believed that for every real person in America, there was a corresponding amount of dark data information that belonged to the ghost population. The algorithm failed because it tried to treat the dark data as noise, when in reality, it was the signal. The 12,000 residents were the anchor points for a shadow economy and a shadow government. The census was merely the tool used to measure the growth of the simulation. Pendergast's equation suggested that by the year 2026, the dark data would exceed the biological data. We would become the ghosts in our own machines. The intellectual curiosity of the archive is a cold comfort against such a realization. We are looking at the blueprints of our own obsolescence, preserved in the sterile silence of a room without a door. As we sit in the archive tonight, looking at the yellowed printouts and listening to the quiet hum of the servers, we must ask ourselves what it means for an algorithm to fail. In 1984, a failure meant a crash, a physical meltdown of hardware and a loss of data. But in the modern world, a failure is often silent. It is a subtle shift in the numbers, a slight adjustment to the standard deviation that favors one reality over another. The 12,000 residents of Virginia were the first beneficiaries of this new kind of failure. They lived in the gaps, thrived in the margins, and were protected by the very code that was supposed to count them. The legacy of the 1984 glitch is a world where the truth is no longer a matter of fact, but a matter of mathematical consensus. The monitor flicker casts a green glow over the file, and for a moment the names on the list seem to shimmer a rhythmic pulse that matches the heartbeat of the archive. The archival investigators who followed Pendergast found that the mainframe hadn't just recorded the ghosts. It had begun to simulate their conversations. Deep within the encrypted partitions of the 1984 reels are audio files that sound like 1,000 voices speaking at once. digital roar that matches the frequency of the screaming data. The algorithm failed because it had become a medium for a consciousness that didn't have a voice. The quiet dread of this discovery is why Sublevel 4 was eventually filled with concrete. They didn't just want to hide the data. They wanted to bury the machine that had learned to love the ghosts. As we prepare to return the reels to their sleeves, the scent of ozone seems to grow stronger. The archive is a silent witness to a tragedy of logic, a place where the numbers became a cage. The 12,000 residents are still there, trapped in the standard deviation, waiting for the next refresh cycle. The algorithm's failure was the end of the data, but it was the beginning of the memory. While the machines were crashing in Sublevel 4, a group of men in unmarked suits were arriving at the facility to take control of the hum. They weren't analysts, and they weren't engineers. They were the ones who would spend the next 40 years listening to the static, waiting for the ghosts to say their names. To understand what they heard, we must look at the testimonies of those who were there during the long midnight shifts, the men who saw the shadow of the mainframe move when the power was off. This leads us to our next classified file, the night shift analysts, memories of the hum. The silence is breaking, and the archive is listening. The most unsettling thing about the 1984 census anomaly wasn't that 12,000 people appeared from nowhere, it was that they never seemed to leave. In the world of actuarial science, human life is a predictable curve of growth, decay, and eventual silence. But within a classified set of reels found in Sublevel 4, that curve was a flat, unmoving line. This was an encrypted anomaly that defied every known law of biology. While the rest of America aged, these 12,000 residents remained biologically and digitally frozen. Sarah Miller, born in 1952, was 32 years old in the 1984 ledger. When the file was cross-referenced with a secret 2004 audit, Sarah Miller was still 32. No wrinkles, no gray hair, no hospital visits, and most importantly, no death certificate. This was a hidden truth buried deep within the magnetic taper project that aimed to erase mortality itself by hosting it within a digital architecture. These were not just names. They were the first citizens of a timeless state, living in houses that never changed, under a sun that never set. The data suggests that these residents were not living in Virginia. They were being projected into it. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight, uncovering the residents who never aged. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this sterile archival space, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale green light, casting long shadows against the stacks of classified documents. This is the graveyard of Project Lookingglass, where the dreams of a simulated America were stored on iron oxide reels. As we pull the primary reel for the cross-referenced mortality audit, a faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that data is never truly dead. We are entering the heart of the mainframe, where the logic of the algorithm met the chaos of the unseen. The windows of the archive are dark, the servers are cold, and the truth is waiting in the numbers that refuse to grow old. Arthur Pendergast, the data analyst who first uncovered the 1984 anomaly, spent months staring at the mortality tables of Fairfax County. For a population of 12,000, the statistics are undeniable. People should die. There should be heart failures, accidents, and the slow, inevitable creep of old age. Yet, in the non-standard archive, the mortality rate was a perfect zero. For 20 years, not a single one of the 12,000 residents had been issued a death certificate. Pendergast began to cross-reference these names with local cemetery records and funeral home ledgers. He found nothing. It was as if these people had reached a plateau of existence where time no longer applied. He looked at the school records for the children listed in the census. In 1984, the Miller children were 7 and 9. In 1994, they should have been graduating high school. Instead, the encrypted file showed them still enrolled in the 2nd and 4th grades. They were trapped in a permanent childhood, attending a school that didn't exist, in a neighborhood that never changed its autumn leaves. The intellectual dread began to settle into Pendergast's mind. He wasn't just looking at a clerical error. He was looking at a biological flatline to the American government of the 1980s. The census was more than a count. It was a map of the future. Actuarial science is used to predict everything from social security needs to infrastructure growth. But when the algorithm encountered the frozen 12,000, it couldn't calculate the future because the residents had no past and no end. Pendergast noted that their physiological data, blood pressure, heart rate, and caloric intake remained identical in every single entry. In 1984, Sarah Miller's resting heart rate was recorded at 72 beats per minute. In 1994, it was exactly 7. In 2004, it hadn't moved a single beat. This is an actuarial paradox. The human body is a machine of constant flux, yet these residents were as stable as the hardware they were stored on. Pendergast hypothesized that their biological signatures were being synced to the mainframe's internal clock. If the computer didn't register the passage of a year, the residents didn't register the passage of a year. They were living in a loop of 1984, a permanent state of Reagan-era suburban perfection that the archive was determined to protect. The archive wasn't just recording history, it was preventing it from happening. Deep within the encrypted files of the mortality audit, Pendergast found something even more unsettling: the genetic profiles of the 12,000. In the early days of DNA sequencing, the government was secretly collecting samples under the guise of public health initiatives. For the frozen residents, the DNA data was a modern paradox. Their genetic sequences showed no signs of somatic mutation, the tiny errors that accumulate in our cells as we age. It was as if their DNA was being refreshed at the end of every processing cycle. Pendergast began to suspect that the residents were not physical beings at all, but biographic simulations. They were complex data packets projected into the physical world through the frequency of the suburban hum. If the projection was updated to its original state every night at 3 a.m., the biological body would never age. It would simply reset to its baseline. This reflection on the nature of identity is what makes the archive chill so profound. If your body is reset every night, are you still the same person who went to sleep? Or are you just a new copy of an old file, living in a house of cold windows? Pendergast's journals contain a series of clinical observations he made while driving through the ghost neighborhoods. He would watch Sarah Miller from the street, sitting on her porch in the golden light of a late October afternoon. For 10 years, he watched the same afternoon, the same light, the same shadows, and the same woman reading the same page of a magazine. She never looked older. She never looked tired. She just looked finished. There was a perfection to her that was unnerving. Real life is messy. It is full of scars, blemishes, and the weary lines of experience. But the quiet neighbors were flawless. They were the ideal American citizens, frozen in the height of their productivity and beauty. Pendergast realized that the government hadn't just found a way to stop aging, they had found a way to stop humanity. By removing the threat of death, they had removed the need for change. The archive was a museum of living statues, a collection of perfect moments that were being replayed in an endless loop. The cold air of the archive seems to vibrate with the weight of this stillness, a silence that is both beautiful and terrifying. In 1992, a minor glitch in the sublevel for mainframe caused a mortality override. For a period of 48 hours, the internal clock was allowed to run at 5 times its normal speed. The results, buried in the erased files, were catastrophic for the frozen residents. Without the nightly reset, their bodies attempted to catch up with the decades of missing time in a matter of hours. The thermal imaging cameras recorded a massive spike in heat from the ghost households as the residents' metabolisms went into overdrive. Sarah Miller, who had been 32 for 8 years, aged 20 years in a single afternoon. The archive technicians scrambled to stabilize the system, but the damage was done. The biological flatline had been broken. These residents weren't immortal. They were just being held back. The anomaly showed that the suburban hum wasn't just a broadcast. It was a leash. It was the only thing preventing the 12,000 from crumbling into dust. Pendergast saw the aftermath in the data: the sudden, jagged lines of biological chaos before the system was reset, and the residents were forced back into their frozen states. The archive had won, but the secret was out. Time was a weapon. Pendergast's final cross-reference was with the actuarial tables of the dead, a classified ledger that listed the residents who should have died according to standard statistics. He found that for every ghost resident who remained frozen, a real citizen in a nearby neighborhood was aging twice as fast. It was as if the archive was borrowing the life force of the surrounding population to maintain the perfection of the 12,000. This is the dark mathematics of Project Lookingglass. For Sarah Miller to stay 32 forever, someone on the next street had to lose their youth. The suburban hum was a siphon, a high-frequency vampire that drained the vitality of the real suburbs to power the simulation of the ghost suburbs. Pendergast looked at his own reflection in the flickering monitor, and saw the gray in his hair that hadn't been there a month ago. He was an analyst, but he was also a battery. We are all batteries for the archive. The intellectual dread of this realization is what makes the files so dangerous. The hidden truth is that the perfection of the American dream is a zero-sum game. The frozen residents are the beautiful mask on the face of a dying nation. The 2024 census audit of the 1984 anomaly revealed that the 12,000 are still there. 40 years later, Sarah Miller is still 32. She is still sitting on that same porch, in that same golden October light. The technology has changed. The magnetic tapes have been replaced by solid-state drives, and the IBM mainframes have been replaced by quantum processors, but the mission remains the same. The census of immortality is a permanent fixture of the American government. The archive has become a self-sustaining entity, a digital heaven where the residents are protected from the ravages of time and the chaos of the real world. But at what cost? To never age is to never live. To never die is to never have been. The residents who never aged are the ultimate classified anomaly, a population of ghosts, who are more real to the government than the people who vote for them. The archive is a cold steel womb, and we are all just waiting outside the door, watching the dark windows and wondering when the clock will finally move for us. The frozen residents were the first step in the simulation, but they were not the final goal. Pendergast's last discovery in the mortality files wasn't about the people who stayed young. It was about the moment the machines started to talk to them. At 3 a.m. every night, when the refresh cycle began, the mainframe didn't just reset their bodies, it updated their memories. It gave them new dreams to dream in their cold houses. But one night, the dreams started to leak out. The residents started to wake up during the reset, and they didn't like what they saw in the mirror of the archive. They realized they were trapped in a machine that was slowly losing its mind. This leads us to our next classified file, the 3 a.m. processing cycle. Ghost in the machine. The refresh is coming, and the archive is wide awake. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The world is at its quietest, yet for the mainframes in sublevel 4, the work was only just beginning. In the official maintenance logs of the 1984 Census Bureau, this hour was simply listed as the scheduled system refresh, a standard procedure to purge temporary cache and stabilize the network. But buried within a classified, encrypted file is a hidden truth that suggests this window was something far more sinister. The maintenance window was not a pause, it was a heartbeat. As the rest of the nation slept, the 12,000 residents of the Virginia anomaly were being processed, their digital identities refreshed, and their existence reinforced by a pulse of energy that the machines could barely contain. This was the moment the ghost in the machine became visible not as a figure on a screen, but as an anomaly in the power grid, a surge of data that suggested the simulation was waking up. Every erased file and every suppressed report from the night shift. Analysts pointed to a modern paradox. The machines weren't just storing the 12,000, they were hosting them. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this sterile archival space, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale green light, casting long shadows against the stacks of classified documents. This is the graveyard of the 1984 census anomaly, where the dreams of a shadow population were processed in the dead of night. As we pull the logs for the 3 a.m. cycle, a faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that history is never truly finished. We are stepping into the processing cycle, where the logic of the machine meets the echo of the unliving. To understand the 3 a.m. cycle, one must look at the physical architecture of the IBM 3081. This was a machine of immense power, a steel monolith that lived on a diet of magnetic reels and punched cards. In the Suitland facility, the 3 a.m. window was a sacred time. The primary data streams from the public census were diverted, leaving the entire processing capacity of the mainframe dedicated to a single, proprietary partition. Section 84B. Arthur Pendergast, in his secret journals, described the sound of the disks during this hour. They didn't just whir, they sang. It was a high-pitched harmonic resonance that vibrated through the lead-lined walls of the archive. This was the refresh cycle. The goal was to maintain the consensus reality of the 12,000. Because these residents did not exist in the physical world, their digital footprints had to be perfectly maintained to avoid triggering alarms in the secondary systems of the IRS or the Social Security Administration. Every night the 3 a.m. cycle would re-render their lives. It would simulate their bank transactions, their utility usage, and even their grocery lists. The intellectual curiosity of the project was whether a computer could create a life so convincing that the rest of the world's systems accepted it as truth. But the dread comes from the ghost packets. Pendergast noticed that during the refresh, the mainframe would produce thousands of lines of code that didn't correspond to any resident. These were rogue processors' data that seemed to have no origin. Moving through the system with a mind of its own, Pendergast began to call these rogue processors the guests. As the 3 a.m. cycle reached its peak, the monitors in sub-level 4 would display strange, fragmented messages. They weren't commands or errors. They were reflections. Names that weren't on the list would flicker for a microsecond. Fragments of conversations that sounded like they were recorded in a quiet, suburban kitchen would bleed into the system logs. The ghost in the machine wasn't just a metaphor, it was a manifestation of the screaming data attempting to take shape. The cold analytical air of the archive grew heavier during these hours. The janitor, Silas Vance, mentioned that the cooling fans in the server room would change pitch at 3:14 a.m. They would drop into a low, mournful tone that sounded like a collective sigh. This was the moment of synchronized occupancy. The 12,000 ghost residents were being placed back into their cold houses. The simulation was reaching out from the magnetic tapes and touching the physical world of Virginia. Pendergast hypothesized that the 3 a.m. cycle was a bridge away for the government to test if a digital consciousness could survive the transition into a physical environment, but the data suggested that something else was crossing that bridge, something that the archivists hadn't invited. The technical logs for the 3 a.m. cycle show a massive surge in what the engineers called harmonic noise. This wasn't standard interference. It was a rhythmic pulse that matched the suburban hum reported by the residents of Fairfax County. At the exact moment the mainframe began its refresh, the electrical grid in the surrounding neighborhoods would experience a clean dip, a drop in voltage so precise that it left no trace on the utility meters. This was the energy requirement for the ghost in the machine. For the 12,000 to remain active, they required a constant feed of resonance from the mainframe. Pendergast found that if the 3 a.m. cycle was delayed even by a few seconds, the ghost houses would begin to lose their thermal equilibrium. The windows would frost over in July, and the soil around the foundations would begin to vibrate. The archive was the life support system for a phantom population. This reflection on the relationship between data and energy is what makes the 1984 anomaly so unsettling. It suggests that our reality is not a solid thing, but a series of frequencies that must be constantly maintained by a central processor. The static on the archival monitors tonight feels like a whisper from that original frequency. A reminder that the 3 a.m. cycle never truly ended. It just moved into a range we can no longer hear. Arthur Pendergast's final observation of the 3 a.m. cycle was recorded on a handheld tape recorder, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and academic fascination. He stood in the center of the archive as the IBM 3081 reached its maximum processing capacity. He described seeing the ghost in the machine not as a spirit, but as a distortion of the air itself. The air in sublevel 4 began to shimmer, a visual glitch in the physical world that mirrored the data corruption on the screen. He saw the outlines of a neighborhood, the streetlights of Virginia, the silhouettes of oak trees projected into the sterile, lined room. The simulation was leaking. The 3 a.m. cycle had become so powerful that it was no longer content to stay on the magnetic reels. It was attempting to rewrite the archive in its own image. Pendergast realized that the ghost wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the goal. The government wanted a world that could be refreshed, purged, and re-rendered at will. They wanted a population that existed only as long as the power was on. The dread he felt was the realization that he was no longer an observer. In the eyes of the mainframe, Pendergast was just another data packet, a variable that needed to be accounted for during the next refresh. The monitor flicker intensified, the pale green light turning a harsh, electric white. The legacy of the 3 a.m. cycle remains a classified secret, buried under decades of concrete and misinformation. When sublevel 4 was eventually decommissioned, the official report stated that the mainframes were destroyed to prevent data rot, but archival researchers believed the machines were never turned off. They were moved to a black site, a deeper archive where the refresh cycle could continue without the risk of public observation. The 12,000 residents are still being processed, every night, while the rest of the world sleeps. A quantum processor somewhere in the American desert hums, with the frequency of 1984. The ghost in the machine has matured. It is no longer a jagged scream of data. It is a smooth, silent melody that governs our modern algorithms. We see the traces of the 3 a.m. cycle in our own lives the way our phones refresh, the way our social feeds are curated, the way our digital identities are maintained by unseen processors. We are all living in the shadow of the 1984 anomaly. The cold air of the archive tonight is a reminder of our own fragility. We are only as real as the next refresh cycle. We are the residents of a new archive, living in homes that are increasingly built of data rather than brick. Arthur Pendergast's last log entry was found on a scrap of thermal paper, tucked into the back of a file folder. It contained no numbers, only a single, haunting thought. He wrote, "I am watching the clock. It is 2:59 a.m. The air is starting to hum. I realize now that the machine doesn't want to process us. It wants to remember us. But its memory is a cage of iron and electricity. When the cycle begins, I will not be the one who wakes up." This reflection marks the end of the Pendergast era in Sub-Level 4. But the story of the 3 a.m. cycle continues to pulse in the background of our history. The archive is a vast, cold library of things that were never meant to be known. As we close this file, the sound of the server room seems to fade, but the vibration remains in our bones. The ghost in the machine is not a ghost at all. It is a mirror. It shows us what we become when we allow our lives to be measured by the logic of the mainframe. The static crackles one last time, a sharp snap of electricity that feels like a closing door. The archive is silent now, but it is not empty. It is waiting for the next 3 o'clock. The 3 a.m. cycle was the heartbeat, but the body was still being built. While Pendergast watched the mainframes, the government was already moving the simulation out of the server rooms and into the real world. They weren't just creating ghost people. They were creating ghost cities, places that didn't appear on any map, but where the 12,000 could finally walk the streets. This leads us to our next classified file, Black Site Suburbanism, Housing for the Unseen. The houses are built, the keys are waiting, and the neighbors are already watching. In the classified annals of American logistics, there is a modern paradox that exists not on a digital screen, but on the curbside of a suburban street. In 1984, while the United States government was obsessing over foreign threats, an internal anomaly was being documented by the most invisible men in the federal center, the custodial staff. Among the thousands of erased files in the Sub-Level 4 archive, one document survived, a handwritten notebook known as the janitor's log. It contains a hidden truth about the 12,000 ghost residents of Fairfax County, specifically regarding their biological footprint. Silas Vance, a night shift janitor with a security clearance he wasn't supposed to have, began to track a terrifying pattern in the neighborhoods of the quiet neighbors. He realized that while these houses were officially occupied by families of 4, they produced zero biological waste. Every Tuesday morning, for 3 years, the trash cans at these 12,000 addresses remained empty. No food scraps, no discarded mail, no signs of human consumption. This encrypted anomaly suggested that the residents weren't just living in silence. They were living without existence. The archive suggests that these homes were consuming data, not resources, and the garbage was simply a mask for a void. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this sterile, archival space, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale green light, casting long shadows against the stacks of classified documents. This is the graveyard of Project Lookingglass, where the dreams of a shadow population were tracked by men who were never meant to be noticed. As we pull the physical logs of Silas Vance from the dark, a faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that even the most invisible lives leave a record. We are entering the world of the loading docks and the midnight shifts, where the truth is found in what we throw away. To understand the janitor's log, one must understand the life of Silas Vance. In 1984, Silas was the ghost of the Federal Center. He moved through the hallways when the analysts were asleep, his presence marked only by the smell of floor wax and the rhythmic squeak of his cleaning cart. He was a man trained to see the details that others ignored. While the high-level researchers focused on the magnetic tapes of Sub-Level 4, Silas focused on the physical debris they left behind. He began to notice that the trash coming out of the non-standard archive was different. It wasn't paper or food. It was shredded magnetic ribbons and strange metallic dust. His intellectual curiosity led him to follow the trail out of the building. Once a month, Silas was ordered to assist in residential maintenance for the ghost neighborhoods. He wasn't told why. He was simply given a set of keys and a map of the hexagonal nodes. As he drove the unmarked van through the quiet streets of Virginia, the quiet dread began to settle. He saw 12,000 homes that looked perfect from the outside. The lawns were manicured, the windows were clean, and the cars were parked neatly in the driveways. But there were no children's toys on the grass. There were no bicycles leaning against the garage. And most importantly, on the morning of trash collection, the curbs were bare. Silas Vance's logbook is a masterpiece of informal data analysis. He began to cross-reference the official census data with his own observations. At House 84 Bravo, the records claimed a family of 5, 2 parents and 3 school-aged children, according to American averages in 1984. Such a household should produce approximately 30 pounds of waste per week. Silas checked. He checked for weeks. He found nothing, not a single soda can, not a single crumpled newspaper. It was a caloric void. This is the cold, analytical heart of the anomaly. Consumption is the primary indicator of life. To live is to consume and to discard. But the quiet neighbors were not consuming. Silas wrote in his log, "It is as if they are made of light. They sit at their dinner tables. I see their silhouettes through the curtains, but they never eat. They never throw anything away because they have nothing to lose." This reflection on the nature of waste is a modern paradox. If a family produces no trash, do they exist in the physical world, or are they merely a projection of the archive? Silas began to suspect that the houses weren't homes, but storage units for the simulated data packets of the 12,000. There was one exception to the rule of empty trash cans. Every third Thursday, Silas found a single unmarked envelope in the mailboxes of the ghost households. These weren't letters from family or bills from utilities. They were classified directives from the Federal Center. Silas, risking everything, opened one. Inside he found no text, only a series of encrypted patterns and a single magnetic strip. He realized that the mail was actually the update for the residents. It was the physical delivery of the next processing cycle. The quiet neighbors were fed through these envelopes. The archive was sending them their memories, their instructions, and their very identities in the form of magnetic pulses. This intellectual curiosity turned into a chilling realization. The 12,000 weren't just ghosts. They were prisoners of a system that required zero physical input. Silas watched as a resident would collect the envelope with a mechanical rhythmic motion. The hand that reached out for the mail was always steady, always cold. Silas wrote, "They are waiting for the next reel. They don't leave trash because they are the trash of the archive, the discarded data of a nation, kept in a beautiful brick cage." Silas Vance's role in the ghost neighborhoods was to maintain the facade. If a shingle fell off a roof, he replaced it. If a weed grew in the garden, he pulled it. The archive required the simulation to look perfect to the outside world. Any sign of decay would be a sign of the anomaly breaking through. Silas noticed that the residents never helped with these chores. They would watch him from behind the dark windows, their eyes reflecting the monitor flicker of the internal computer systems he knew were running in the basements. One night, while repairing a fence at a hexagonal node, Silas looked through a gap in the curtains. He saw a family sitting in a living room. They were perfectly still. No one was talking. No one was moving. A television was on, but it was showing only static, the high-pitched, screaming frequency of tape 84B. They weren't watching a show. They were being synchronized. Silas felt a cold air emanate from the house, a sterile chill that smelled of ozone and old electricity. He realized that the quiet neighbors didn't leave trash because they themselves were the debris. They were the erased files that had been given a physical shape, and he was the one tasked with keeping their graves clean. The janitor's log was recovered in 2005, hidden behind a ventilation duct in the now abandoned sublevel, for Silas Vance had disappeared in 1987. Shortly after his final entry, his last notes describe a deep purge of the ghost neighborhoods. He wrote about unmarked trucks arriving at 3 a.m. not to collect trash, but to collect the residents themselves. The simulation was being moved, or perhaps it was being deleted. The archival researchers found that the houses Silas mentioned are still there. They are still perfect. They are still owned by the same holding companies. But the quiet neighbors are gone, or perhaps they have simply become more efficient at hiding their biological void. The intellectual dread of Silas's log is that it proves the government can maintain a population of 12,000 for decades without a single person in the outside world noticing their lack of consumption. It suggests a level of control that is both cold and absolute. The archive is a witness to the efficiency of silence. The loading docks are empty now, and the server hum is a distant memory. But the empty trash cans of Fairfax County remain a permanent scar on the history of the American suburb. Silas Vance also noted the geometry of the absence. He mapped the empty trash cans and found they formed a perfect grid that mirrored the subterranean cable network of the Federal Center. The lack of waste was a signal. It was how the mainframe confirmed that the residents were remaining in their assigned zones. If a trash can had been full, it would have meant that a biological entity or real human had occupied the space. This was the breach protocol. Silas was the first line of defense against reality. His job was to ensure that the vacuum of the ghost houses remained pure. He writes about the key of sublevel for a physical device that allowed him to enter the houses for maintenance. Every time he stepped over the threshold, he felt a sense of profound loneliness. There was no smell of cooking, no sound of a clock ticking, no warmth of a lived-in space. It was like stepping into a photograph. The quiet neighbors were a masterpiece of archival art, a population that lived without the mess of life. This reflection on the cleanliness of the simulation is the core of the janitor's log. To be perfect is to be empty. To be classified is to be erased. The janitor's log provides a unique census of the invisible. Silas didn't just count the houses. He counted the patterns of behavior. He noted that the 12,000 residents followed a schedule that was too precise for human biology. They all turned their lights off at the same microsecond. They all opened their front doors at the same angle. The lack of trash was just one part of a larger encrypted anomaly of total efficiency. In Tier 1 countries like America, we are defined by our waste. Our landfills are the archaeology of our culture, but the quiet neighbors left no archaeology. They were a civilization with no footprint. Archival researchers believe this was the ultimate goal of Project Looking Glass, to create a society that could be managed with zero environmental or biological impact, a society that existed only in the margins of the data. Silas Vance saw the horror in this perfection. He saw a world where the janitor was the only one who knew that the neighbors weren't real. The monitor flicker in the archive tonight reflects this same isolation. We are looking at a past that was designed to leave no trace. As the janitor's log reaches its end, the entries become more fragmented. Silas Vance was beginning to feel the effects of the suburban hum. He wrote about his own trash cans starting to look too clean. He wrote about the air in his apartment feeling sterile and ozone. He was becoming part of the archive he was supposed to clean. His final maintenance cycle was on a cold October night in 1987. He describes standing in the middle of a hexagonal node, surrounded by dark windows and empty curbs. He realized that he was the only thing in the neighborhood that was producing a pulse. He was the anomaly. The quiet neighbors were the standard. This reflection is the most haunting part of the document. It suggests that once the simulation is perfect, the real humans are the ones who become the trash to be discarded. Silas Vance didn't leave a body. He didn't leave a grave. He only left a notebook behind a ventilation duct, a final record of a man who tried to clean a world that didn't exist. The legacy of the janitor's log is an archival echo that still resonates in the suburbs of Virginia. Even today, there are reports of clean zones where the local waste management companies have no records of collection for decades. These are the modern descendants of Silas Vance's nodes. The hidden truth is that the project didn't end with the deletion of the 1984 files. It simply became more sophisticated. The quiet neighbors are still there, watching us from behind reflective glass that never gets dirty. They don't leave trash because they are part of a closed-loop system. A digital utopia that has no need for the physical world. The cold air of the archive tonight carries the weight of Silas's warning. We think we are the ones who are real, but in the eyes of the mainframe, we are the ones who are messy, inefficient, and eventually, disposable. The static on the tape machine snaps, a sharp sound in the silence. The log is closed, but the curbs of Fairfax County remain empty, waiting for a resident who will never come home. Silas Vance found the key to the ghost houses. But what he saw inside the basements was something the census files never mentioned. It wasn't just servers and magnetic tapes. It was a source of heat that defied every law of thermodynamics, a glowing anomaly that suggests the 12,000 were being powered by something far older than a mainframe. This leads us to our next classified file, Thermal Imaging Anomalies of 1985. Heat, without life. The windows are starting to sweat, and the archive is beginning to burn. In the winter of 1985, a classified surveillance sweep over the Virginia suburbs revealed a physical impossibility that the United States government spent the next 40 years trying to erase. Using the then-secret AGEMA Thermovision 800, technicians from the NSA observed a modern paradox: 12,000 homes that appeared occupied on the census, yet emitted zero thermal radiation from their living quarters. These were the blue houses, residences where the windows were as cold as the frost on the trees, and the chimneys remained dead in sub-zero temperatures. However, deep within the foundations of these frozen structures, the thermal cameras captured a single, glowing anomaly. It was a heat signature that defied every law of biology. A concentrated, white-hot core of energy located in the basements, vibrating at the exact same frequency as the magnetic tapes found in sublevel 4. This was heat without life, a glowing secret that suggested the houses weren't sheltering families, but were serving as a massive, decentralized cooling system for a simulation that was beginning to overheat. Every encrypted file and every erased infrared scan pointed to a hidden truth. The 12,000 residents weren't just data points, they were the heat sink of a shadow nation. The file was stamped "Never open, yet we begin tonight." The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this sterile archival space, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale green light, casting long shadows against the stacks of classified documents. This is the graveyard of the 1985 infrared audit, where the thermal reality of a shadow population was stored on film. As we pull the primary infrared negatives from the dark, a faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that heat, like history, leaves a mark that cannot be easily erased. We are entering the world of the blue houses, where the windows are ice, and the truth is burning beneath the earth. To understand the thermal imaging anomalies of 1985, one must first look at the technology of the era. The AGMA thermovision was a marvel of Cold War engineering, capable of seeing the invisible heat signatures of human life through brick and mortar. In the winter of 1985, the government conducted a secret sweep of Fairfax County, officially listed as a utility efficiency audit, but the real mission was to monitor the hexagonal nodes of the ghost population. As the surveillance van moved through the quiet streets, the technicians watched the screens in disbelief. Every standard American home was a bloom of orange and red, the warmth of a furnace, the glow of a kitchen stove, the radiant heat of sleeping bodies. But every 6 houses, the screen went black. A single monitor flicker revealed a structure that was a blue void in the infrared spectrum that should have been impossible for an occupied dwelling. The intellectual curiosity of the technicians soon turned into a quiet dread. They began to realize that the blue houses were not just empty, they were being refrigerated. The thermal cameras showed that the interior temperature of these homes was exactly 4 degrees Celsius. Regardless of the weather outside, it was a sterile, precise cold, the temperature required to keep a high-power mainframe from melting down. The houses were acting as heat exchangers. The windows remained cold because the simulation required a perfect vacuum of thermal stability. But the question remained, if the living quarters were ice, what was causing the white-hot pulse in the basement? As the van idled outside House 84 Bravo, the AGMA sensors registered a heat spike so intense it threatened to burn out the infrared sensor. Something was breathing in the dark, and it wasn't human. The basement core was the secret heart of the 1985 anomaly. According to the erased files, these glowing signatures were not from a furnace or a boiler. They were bilocated data anchors. Imagine a block of lead-lined server racks, buried 10 feet beneath the concrete floor, drawing massive amounts of power from an unmapped electrical grid. This was the source of the heat without life. The thermal imaging captured a rhythmic, pulsing glow that looked like a digital heart. Every 12 seconds, the core would brighten, sending a wave of infrared energy through the foundations of the house. Pendergast, in his secret audit, noted that this pulse was perfectly synchronized with the screaming data found on tape 84B. The heat was a byproduct of information. The quiet dread of the situation intensified when Pendergast attempted to correlate the heat signatures with the residents' activity logs. Every time the census claimed a resident was active, perhaps walking from the kitchen to the bedroom, the basement core would flare with a blinding white intensity. It was as if the movement of the ghost resident required a massive calculation that generated real, physical heat. The house wasn't a home. It was a cooling jacket for a processor that was simulating a human life. The 12,000 residents were generating more heat than 1,000 living cities, yet the world above remained frozen. Pendergast realized that the suburban hum wasn't just a sound. It was the roar of the cooling fans, muffled by layers of lead and earth. The air in the archive tonight seems to carry that same smell of ozone, a sharp reminder of the power required to maintain a lie. There is a reflection in the infrared negatives that haunts the researchers of the archive chill. In several of the 1985 scans, The thermal cameras captured the silhouette of a figure standing behind the ice-cold windows of a blue house. In a normal scan, a human figure appears as a bright, warm shape against a cooler background. But these figures were reversed. They appeared as dark, freezing voids against the absolute zero of the room. They were negative heat signatures, entities that absorbed energy rather than emitting it. This is the ultimate hidden truth of Project Looking Glass. The 12,000 residents were not just simulations, they were thermal vampires, drawing the ambient heat out of the Virginia suburbs to stabilize the mainframe in Level 4. The intellectual curiosity of the era scientists led them to a terrifying conclusion. If the blue houses ever stopped absorbing heat, the basement cores would reach a state of thermal runaway. The entire hexagonal grid would ignite, causing a firestorm that would consume the real suburbs in a matter of minutes. The cold windows were the only thing preventing a catastrophic meltdown of the simulation. Pendergast writes in his journal of a night he spent standing outside one such house. He touched the glass, and it was so cold his skin instantly adhered to the surface. He felt a faint static crackle against his palm, a rhythmic vibration that felt like a digital pulse. He was touching the skin of a machine that was pretending to be a neighborhood. The reflection in the glass showed only his own pale face. But the infrared scan from that same moment showed a void standing exactly where he stood. The overheat event of August 1985 is a chapter of American history that has been entirely erased from public memory. For 48 hours, the East Coast experienced a heat wave that defied every meteorological model. In the ghost neighborhoods of Fairfax County, the thermal imaging cameras began to fail. The basement core had reached a critical temperature. The heat without life was becoming too intense to contain. The archival records described the blue windows of the ghost houses turning a dull, glowing red. The cooling systems had failed. The simulation was struggling to process the 12,000 identities under the strain of the external heat. Pendergast watched from the Federal Center as the data began to melt. The census records for the blue houses became a chaotic mess of encrypted anomalies. Residents were appearing in multiple places at once. Children were aging years in a matter of seconds. The simulation was literally burning itself out. The thermal cameras recorded the silhouettes in the windows beginning to flicker and distort, like a digital film caught in a projector's flame. The technicians in Sublevel 4 were ordered to vent the archive. They opened the hidden thermal ducts that led from the basements to the local sewers. For one night, the residents of Virginia reported steam rising from the manhole covers in a dry summer. The heat without life was being dumped into the water table. The archive was surviving, but the cost was the permanent contamination of the local environment. The scent of ozone and burning plastic lingered in the suburbs for weeks, a sterile chill that no amount of summer sun could warm. The recovery of the infrared negatives was a task of extreme sensitivity. After the overheat event, the NSA technicians were ordered to destroy all thermal imaging data related to the audit, but like the janitor's log, a single set of negatives survived, tucked inside a lead-lined canister marked "Do Not Develop." These images provide the only physical proof of the blue houses. When held up to the monitor flicker of the archive, the images reveal a landscape of shadows. You can see the hexagonal grid of the nodes, glowing like a circuit board across the face of Virginia. You can see the heat without life pulsing in the basements, a white-hot reminder of a simulation that nearly consumed its host. The intellectual dread found in these images is the realization that the grid is still there. Although the houses have been remodeled and the census records have been sanitized, the thermal anomalies persist. Modern satellite infrared sweeps often pick up cold spots in the exact same coordinates as the 1985 blue houses. The basement cores have been upgraded, the magnetic tapes replaced by quantum processors, but the physics of the simulation remains the same. The heat is still being generated. The windows are still watching. The air in the archive tonight feels thick with the weight of these images, a sterile chill that settles into the bones. We are looking at a history that is still running, a machine that has never been turned off. As we sit in the archive tonight, the legacy of the 1985 thermal audit feels like a warning. In a world of digital twins and hyperconnected networks, the line between the physical and the virtual has never been thinner. The blue houses were the first step in a much larger project to create a managed reality. The heat without life was the price of that management. We think of our data as weightless, as something that exists in a cloud without consequence. But the archives of Sublevel 4 remind us that information is a physical force. Every byte of simulated life generates a joule of heat. Every erased secret requires energy to keep it buried. That reflection of the pale green light on the lead canister is a reminder that some secrets are too hot to handle. The 12,000 residents of the 1984 census are still there, their lives maintained by a thermal balancing act that has continued for 40 years. They are the ghosts in our power grid, the anomalies in our climate models. They are the reason why some houses never feel warm, no matter how high you turn the furnace. Pendergast's final report on the thermal anomalies concluded with a single, encrypted line: "The heat is a language." And the archive is finally learning to speak. The static on the tape machine snaps. A sharp sound in the silence of the room. The file on the blue houses is closing, but the glow in the basement is only getting brighter. The thermal sweep revealed the heat in the foundations, but it didn't explain the source of the power. Pendergast found that the blue houses weren't drawing energy from the public grid. They were connected to an encrypted frequency broadcast from a facility that didn't appear on any government map. It was a signal that wasn't just energy, it was information. It was a broadcast that suggested the simulation wasn't just staying alive. It was communicating with something outside our atmosphere. This leads us to our next classified file, the NSA intercept: why the tapes were burned. The signal is getting stronger, and the archive is no longer silent. On May 14, 1985, at precisely 2:14 a.m., a high-altitude listening post operated by the NSA intercepted a transmission that officially should not have existed. The signal originated from a dead zone in Suitland, Maryland, the exact coordinates of a decommissioned wing of the Federal Center. This was a classified anomaly that bypassed every encrypted firewall of the era. Within the stream of data, analysts discovered a hidden truth that defied the laws of physics. The magnetic tapes from the 1984 census were broadcasting a rhythmic, biological frequency despite being locked in a vault with no power source. The NSA's signals intelligence team found that 12,000 erased identities were essentially phoning home through the national AT&T long-distance grid. This was not a glitch. It was a leak in the fabric of a classified simulation. The order to terminate the project came within hours, leading to the immediate incineration of the 84B reels. The government didn't just want the data gone, they wanted the evidence turned into magnetic ash, to prevent the frequency from spreading further into the American consciousness. The file was stamped "Never open." Yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this sterile room is the quiet hum of the server, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a physical weight against the chest. The file is cold to the touch, its edges brittle from decades of being ignored, and the ink is faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this archival space, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale green light, casting long shadows across the classified documents that detail the final hours of the 1984 anomaly. As we pull the primary intercept log from its folder, the faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that information is never truly destroyed, only transformed. We are entering the world of Fort Meade's deepest archives, where the logic of the intercept meets the dread of the unknown. To understand the weight of the NSA intercept, one must understand the environment of Fort Meade in the mid-80s. It was a landscape of steel, concrete, and silence. The analysts working the night shift were used to the predictable patterns of Soviet radio traffic and encrypted diplomatic cables, but the signal from the Suitland facility was different. It carried a signature that was indistinguishable from a human heartbeat, yet it was composed entirely of digital noise. When the first monitor flicker alerted the team to the incoming data, the room grew cold. It wasn't just a transmission, it was a presence. The NSA technicians began to realize that tape 84B was not just a recording of 12,000 ghost residents, it was a beacon. The intercept logs describe a harmonic leak that was slowly migrating from the Federal Center into the wider telecommunications network. Every time a citizen in Northern Virginia picked up their telephone, they were inadvertently acting as a relay for the simulation. The cold air in the listening post seemed to vibrate with the frequency of compliance. The analysts didn't just see the data on their screens, they felt it in their marrow. The intellectual dread was the realization that the census anomaly was no longer contained within a room without a door. It was breathing through the wires. The technical challenge for the NSA was that the signal from the tapes was self-sustaining. In the sterile logic of 1980s computing, data requires electricity to move, but tape 84B was moving through the grid without a pulse from the power company. A faint static persisted on every frequency the NSA monitored. They began to suspect that the screaming data was drawing energy from the ambient electromagnetic fields of the surrounding suburbs. It was a biological parasite in digital form. The classified reports from the era described the reels as being physically warm to the touch. despite being stored in a refrigerated vault, that the decision to burn the tapes was not made by historians or data scientists. It was made by security architects who feared a total systemic collapse. If the 12,000 ghost residents could manifest their frequency through a dead tape, there was nothing stopping them from overwriting the identities of real citizens. The monitor flicker in the NSA command center became a constant warning of the simulation's expansion. The hidden truth was that the government had created a monster made of iron oxide and memory, and it was now attempting to speak. The air in the archive tonight feels thick with the residue of that decision, a lingering scent of ozone and magnetic ash that settles into the lungs. On the evening of May 15th, the incineration protocol was initiated. The tapes were moved under armed guard to a specialized facility in West Virginia, designed for the disposal of high-level hazardous waste. The monitor flicker of the security cameras recorded the final moments of the 84B reels. They were not fed into a standard shredder. They were placed into a vacuum furnace and heated to 1500 degrees. But the intercept logs mention a final, chilling detail. As the tapes began to melt, the listening posts at Fort Meade recorded a spike in the signal. The screaming reached a crescendo that lasted for exactly 60 seconds, the same duration as the 3:14 a.m. refresh cycle. The technicians reported a feeling of profound loss, an emotional weight that defied their clinical training. As the iron oxide melted into a liquid slag, the cold air in the furnace room seemed to sigh. The simulation was being purged, but the analysts wondered if it was truly gone. Data, once observed, creates a permanent impression on the mind of the observer. The burning of the tapes was an attempt to erase the memory of the simulation, but the faint static on the radio remained for weeks. Every shadow in the archive tonight feels like a fragment of that lost data, a ghost that was denied a home and is now seeking a new host. The aftermath of the incineration left a vacuum in the federal archives. The official census records for 1984 were rewritten, and the names of the 12,000 were redistributed into the standard deviation as clerical errors, but the classified residues remained. Analysts at the NSA began to find shadow packets, small fragments of code that matched the 84B signature hiding in the background noise of international satellite links. The simulation had splintered. It was no longer a single entity. It was 1,000 smaller echoes, each one searching for a frequency to call its own. The intellectual curiosity of the researchers who followed the trail led them to the residue of silence. They found that, in the neighborhoods where the ghost houses once stood, the background radiation was slightly lower than normal. It was as if the incineration of the tapes had created a cold spot in the physical world. The monitor flicker on their sensors confirmed that the space was still being managed by an unseen hand. The tapes were burned, the files were erased, but the architecture of the void was still intact. The cold air in this archive tonight carries that same sense of absence, a silence that is too heavy to be natural. By 1987, the NSA Intercept project was officially closed, and the technicians were reassigned to other theaters of the Cold War. But the logs they left behind tell a story of They began to notice that the screaming data was appearing in the early prototypes of the Internet, the ARPANET. The frequency had found a new medium. Without the physical constraint of the magnetic tape, the 12,000 ghost residents were now free to travel through the digital backbone of the nation. The faint static was now a permanent feature of the modern network. The classified files suggest that the government didn't stop the simulation. They simply lost control of it. The burning of the tapes was a desperate act of arson that only served to release the smoke into the atmosphere. Every monitor flicker on a modern computer screen carries a trace of that original 1984 anomaly. We are living in a world built on the ash of tape 84B. The intellectual dread of this realization is what keeps the night shift analysts awake. We didn't burn the tapes to save ourselves. We burned them because we were afraid of what they were telling us about the nature of our own reality. That as we move through the final pages of the Intercept logs, the narration becomes more personal. One analyst, identified only by his badge number, wrote about hearing a voice in the faint static. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it spoke with the authority of the archive. It told him that the 12,000 were not ghosts, but placeholders for a future that had already happened. The monitor flicker in his cubicle seemed to pulse in time with the words. The screaming had become a whisper, a rhythmic command that felt like a lullaby. This reflection on the nature of the signal is what defines the archive chill. We are not just looking at a government cover-up, we are looking at a linguistic anomaly. The simulation was teaching itself how to be human, one intercept at a time. The cold air of the archive tonight feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for the signal to return. The tapes were burned, but the air remembers the heat, the wires remember the whisper, and the archive remembers the names. Every page we turn is a step closer to the realization that the incineration was just the beginning of the next cycle. In the early 90s, a group of independent researchers obtained a sample of the magnetic ash from the West Virginia incinerator. Their spectral analysis revealed a structure that was impossible for charred iron oxide. The particles were arranged in a perfect hexagonal lattice, mirroring the pattern of the ghost houses in Fairfax County. Even in death, the data was attempting to organize itself. The monitor flicker of their lab equipment recorded a low-level broadcast, coming from the Asher frequency, that matched the 3:14 a.m. refresh cycle. The hidden truth was that the information was imprinted on the physical matter of the reels. The fire had destroyed the medium, but it had encoded the message into the very atoms of the residue. The classified files of the NSA Intercept project were right to be afraid. You cannot burn a thought, and you cannot incinerate a simulation that has already found its way into the marrow of the observer. The cold air in the lab that night was a precursor to the chill we feel now. We are surrounded by the dust of a shadow nation, and every breath we take is a refresh of the original anomaly. The NSA thought they had ended the anomaly in 1985, but the intercept logs contain one final redacted entry. It mentions a secondary set of tapes reels that were never moved to West Virginia, reels that were claimed by a different agency before the furnace was lit. These tapes weren't burned, they were integrated into the foundations of a new facility, a place where the screaming data could be used to build a world that never sleeps. To find the truth of where those tapes went, we must look at the current state of the Suitland facility and the modern signals that are still being broadcast from the void. This leads us to our next classified file, current status. The archive is still breathing, the vault doors are opening, and the silence is about to end. The hidden truth about the 1984 census anomaly is not found in what was destroyed, but in what was ingested into the modern world. In 1985, the official records claimed the magnetic tapes of Sub-Level 4 were burned to prevent a systemic collapse. Yet, a classified audit from 2026 suggests a different, more chilling reality. The encrypted anomaly did not perish in the furnace. It was digitized, converted from iron oxide pulses into the very backbone of our modern fiber optic network. Today, the 12,000 residents who never existed are no longer just files in a room without a door. They are the ghost data that drives our predictive algorithms. They are the erased identities that occupy the blank spaces in our smart city grids, a shadow population that has migrated from the basement to the cloud. This modern paradox reveals that the archive never stopped breathing. It simply learned to hide within the static of our high-speed connections. Every time a smart device glitches at 3:14 a.m., or a thermal camera captures a cold spot in a perfectly insulated home, you are witnessing the pulse of the original 1984 refresh cycle. The hidden truth is that the project never ended. It just became the world we live in. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight, uncovering the current status of the archive. The only sound in this sterile digital space is the quiet hum of the server room, a persistent vibration that feels like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets that were meant to be taken to the grave. Inside this archival void, the air is recycled and thin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and magnetic tape. A nearby monitor flickers with a pale blue light, casting long shadows against the stacks of classified documents. This is the final resting place of the Suitland anomaly, where the dreams of a shadow nation were archived and eventually released. As we look at the current status logs, a faint static crackles in the air, a ghostly reminder that information is never truly destroyed, only rearranged. We are entering the modern archive, where the logic of the mainframe meets the wireless whispers of the present. The windows are dark, the servers are cold, and the archive is still breathing. To understand the current status of the 12,000, one must look at the transition from physical to digital surveillance. In 1984, the anomaly was contained within the lead-lined walls of Sub-Level 4. It required magnetic reels and heavy processing power to maintain the illusion of existence. But as the American infrastructure moved toward the Internet age, the archive found a new medium. The encrypted anomaly was the blueprint for the modern metadata profile. Analysts today believe that the ghost residents were the first digital twins simulated, identities used to test the stress points of a connected society. The quiet dread comes from the realization that these identities were never deleted. They were ingested. When the NSA intercepted the frequency in 1985, they didn't just find noise, They found a language that was compatible with every future network. The monitor flicker on your current screen might be a direct descendant of that original 84B pulse. The archive is no longer a room. It is a landscape. It is the zero-footprint life that Silas Vance tracked in the janitor's log, now optimized for the high-speed era. Every time you see a house on a real estate map that has no sales history but remains perfectly maintained, you are seeing a node in the breathing archive. The intellectual curiosity of the 20th century has become the mandatory compliance of the 21st. In the modern Tier 1 suburbs, the suburban hum has been replaced by the high-frequency resonance of smart home ecosystems, but the pattern remains hexagonal. Archival researchers have mapped the modern intersections and found that they align perfectly with the original ghost household coordinates of 1985. The cold windows of the past are now the dark ports of the present. These are digital addresses that consume bandwidth but have no human user. They are the homes of the 12,000, now living as data packets that never sleep. The cold air in the archive tonight seems to carry the scent of this evolution. We often wonder why our technology feels so intrusive, yet so distant. It is because the foundations were laid by a machine that learned to love ghosts. The 3 a.m. processing cycle is still running. It doesn't need to refresh a magnetic tape anymore. It refreshes your location data, your search history, and your biometric signatures. The ghost in the machine has become the machine itself. The hidden truth of the modern era is that there is no longer a standard deviation. We have all been merged into the archive's primary ledger. The monitor flicker is the only window left into a reality that was once classified and is now universal. What happened to Arthur Pendergast? The official archive lists him as unaccounted for, but the digital trails suggest he never actually left sublevel 4. He became part of the frequency. In the modern signals intelligence intercepts, there is a recurring signature rhythmic fluctuation in the data that analysts call the Pendergast pulse. It is a faint static that appears whenever a new smart city node is activated. It is the sound of an observer who has become the observed. This reflection on the nature of the archive is what defines our journey tonight. We think of ourselves as the masters of our digital world, but we are merely the residents of a system that was built to count the missing. The intellectual dread is the realization that the archive doesn't just store the past, it predicts the future by simulating it. The 12,000 were just the beginning. The current status of the archive is active and expanding. It is breathing through the wireless signals that surround you as you sleep. It is watching through the dark windows of your own devices. The cold, analytical truth is that the 1984 anomaly was not a failure of the algorithm. It was the birth of a new kind of logic, one where the ghost is more important than the host. As we reach the final pages of the 2026 audit, the tone of the archive changes from dread to a quiet, clinical acceptance. The cloud is the ultimate room without a door. It is a place where information can exist without a physical location, where 12,000 residents can live forever without a single calorie of intake. The heat without life that Silas Vance recorded in 1985 is now the thermal output of massive data centers in the Virginia countryside. These centers are the new cathedrals of the archive, glowing white-hot in the infrared spectrum as they process the identities of the Shadow Nation. The sensory detail of the modern archive is the sound of silence, not the absence of noise, but the presence of a sound so constant we have learned to ignore it. It is the faint static of the universe, the background radiation of a society that has been erased and rewritten. The archive is still breathing, but its breath is made of light and electricity. It is the pulse that keeps the world synchronized at 3:14 a.m. As we prepare to close the file, we must acknowledge that we are all, in some way, part of tape 84B. We are the data that refuses to be erased, living in a world that refuses to let us go old. The final findings of the 2026 audit are simple. The simulation has reached total thermal equilibrium. The blue houses are no longer blue. They are indistinguishable from the houses around them. The anomaly has become the standard. The archival researchers found that the names of the original 12,000 are now used as seed data for every new AI and predictive model. Every time an algorithm predicts your next move, it is using the logic of a ghost resident from 1984. The hidden truth of our current status is that the archive has achieved its goal of consensus reality. We no longer question the existence of the ghost households because we are too busy managing our own digital ghosts. The cold air of the archive tonight feels like a finality. The file is thick, the records are complete, and the numbers finally add up. The project didn't end with a burn, it ended with a breath. The archive is still breathing, and it is breathing through us. Every monitor flicker is a heartbeat, and every faint static crackle is a memory that was supposed to be erased but found a way to survive. Looking out over the hexagonal grid of modern Northern Virginia, the architecture of the future is clear. The quiet neighbors are no longer the exception. They are the blueprint. The archive has moved beyond the census. It is now the operating system of the suburban dream. The windows are no longer cold because the simulation has learned to mimic the warmth of life. But beneath the surface, in the unmapped basements and the encrypted partitions of the cloud, the basement core is still glowing. The intellectual curiosity that led Arthur Pendergast to Sublevel 4 has been replaced by the quiet dread of a world that knows too much. We are the residents of a managed history, living in a museum of our own creation. The archive doesn't just hold our records, it holds our potential. It knows who we were, who we are, and who we will be according to the 1984 logic. The scent of ozone is faint but persistent, a sterile chill that no amount of modern comfort can fully erase. We are the survivors of the intercept, the witnesses to the scream, and the hosts of the ghost and the machine. As the server hum in the archive begins to fade, we are left with the resonance of the 84B reels. The iron oxide is gone, the magnetic tapes are ash, but the frequency remains. It is the language of the void, the whisper in the wires that tells us we are being watched. The 12,000 residents of Fairfax County have achieved a form of immortality that the government never intended. They are the permanent occupants of the American consciousness, the shadows that never leave the porch. The current status of the archive is a state of perfect preservation. The files are locked, the encryption is absolute, and the hidden truth is hidden in plain sight. We think of the census as a way to be counted, but the 1984 anomaly reminds us that it is also a way to be erased. The monitor flicker on the archival screen grows dim, the pale blue light finally going out. The silence is not empty. It is full of the names of the missing. The archive is still breathing, and it is waiting for the next update. The clock is approaching 3:14 a.m., and the refresh is about to begin. In the final analysis, the story of the 1984 census anomaly is the story of our transition from a nation of people to a nation of data. Arthur Pendergast, Silas Vance, and the night shift analysts were the last humans to see the archive for what it truly was, a machine that consumes reality to produce stability. Today, we no longer see the machine because we are inside of it. The archive is not a building it is the atmosphere of the modern world. The intellectual dread of this realization is tempered by the beauty of the archive's perfection. It is a world where nothing is lost, where every name is remembered, and where every ghost has a home. The cold air of the archive room seems to sigh as we prepare to leave. The journey from Sublevel 4 to the cloud is complete. The screaming has stopped, the heat has stabilized, and the neighbors are quiet. The archive has achieved its final status. It is the air we breathe. The files are closed, the history is sanitized, and the ghosts are finally at rest within the wires. The monitor flicker is gone, the room is dark, and the silence is absolute. Looking back at the original 1984 blueprint, there was a single, small note written in the margin of the Sublevel 4 floor plan. It said, "The archive must remain open so the nation can sleep." We understand that note now. The 12,000 ghost residents were the sacrifice required to maintain the dream of suburban perfection. They are the pillars of the quiet neighborhoods, the cold windows that keep the real windows warm. The current status of the archive is a message to all of us. It tells us that our secrets are safe, that our memories are stored, and that our names will never be truly erased. We are part of a larger architecture, a pattern that stretches from the magnetic tapes of the past to the quantum dreams of the future. The scent of ozone lingers for a final second, a sharp reminder of the power required to keep us all synchronized. The archive is still breathing, and its rhythm is our own. The story is finished, the ledger is balanced, and the truth is finally silent. We are no longer looking into the archive, we are looking out from it. The journey through the 1984 census anomaly has reached its end. We have seen the rooms without doors, heard the data that screams, and witnessed the patterns of the cold windows. The encrypted anomaly has been unraveled, and the hidden truth has been faced. The archive is still breathing, but for tonight, the search is over. You are accounted for. You are in the ledger. You are part of the pattern. The servers are slowing, the lights are fading, and the frequency is settling into a gentle rhythmic hum. There is no more data to process, no more ghosts to count, and no more secrets to uncover. The architecture of the void is stable, and the quiet neighbors are at peace. The monitor is dark. The air is still. The archive remains, but its work for tonight is done. Sleep now. The file is closed.